I'll bet anyone here $50 the new nurse quits within a week. That is what Dr. Whitfield said 48 hours before 3 Black Hawks landed on Cedar Creek Medical's rooftop. The trauma bay smells like antiseptic and floor wax under flickering fluorescent lights. Natalie Hayes folds an intake chart with steady hands, her Navy issue watch barely visible under her scrub sleeve. She doesn't look up when Dr. Whitfield makes his announcement. Doesn't flinch when he laughs. The 10 doctors gathered around him laugh too, a sound like wind through an empty warehouse, hollow and territorial. They don't know they're standing next to a legend. She moves through the emergency room like water finding the lowest point, competent, invisible, methodical. Her scrubs are hospital-issue white, generic as snow. Her name badge reads N. Hayes, RN in block letters. Nobody reads the fine print. Nobody ever does. In her locker, hidden beneath extra socks and a spare stethoscope, sits a pair of worn combat boots from Bagram. 20 years old. Desert dust still embedded in the treads like fossils. She touches them every morning before her shift, pressing her thumb against the worn leather, grounding herself. The boots are the only thing she brought from her other life. The only thing she'll keep. She favors her left leg slightly when she walks, not a limp, exactly. A preference. A scar runs up her inner thigh, colloid tissue that catches on the edge of her scrub sometimes. Pain is information. Pain is data. She learned that in the Hindu Kush, not in any nursing textbook. She learned it holding a soldier's leg together while waiting for a bird that might not come. Natalie approaches the trauma bay where Marcus Brennan lies motionless in a hospital bed near the window. The boy is 8 years old. Skin the color of old parchment. Eyes open but looking at nothing. A ventilator breathes for him, the hiss and sigh of the machine the only sound the child makes anymore. Machines speak louder than children in places like this. Machines always win. His chart weighs almost nothing in her hands. She's reviewed it 3 times already this morning, committing every detail to the architecture of her memory. 6 months ago. IED blast. Shrapnel lodged near the brainstem, C2 vertebra region, penetrating to within 4 millimeters of the pyramidal tract. The kind of wound that ends people. Ends futures. Ends the sound of a child's voice. Colonel James Brennan, Air Force, stationed at Nellis before the blast near Bagram, sits in a chair beside his son's bed. He wears civilian clothes now. Jeans and a collared shirt, the uniform of a man displaced from his own life. His hands rest on his knees, palms up like empty offerings. He's been sitting in that chair for 6 months. Natalie can see the wear pattern on the upholstery, the specific shape of his weight. 10 specialists have declared Marcus's condition permanent. Untreatable. Their words are stamped across the chart like a death certificate that hasn't yet taken effect. Neurologist, neurosurgeon, spinal specialist, physiatrist, pediatric orthopedist, 3 more whose credentials blur together after the first reading. All of them reach the same conclusion. All of them are wrong. They don't know that Natalie Hayes held a bleeding soldier's spinal cord together with her own 2 hands while the sand turned red around them. They don't know that she learned combat medicine in the worst classroom on earth. They don't know that pain taught her to read human bodies the way other people read books. Dr. Whitfield enters Marcus's room. He moves like a man who has never been told no, whose voice has never cracked under pressure, whose authority has never been questioned in ways that mattered. He's maybe 55, built like someone who has invested in a personal trainer since his early 30s. A Rolex catches the fluorescent light on his left wrist. Expensive. Unnecessary. The kind of watch that says I'm comfortable with my own importance. Still no change, he says to Colonel Brennan, not a question but a confirmation of a verdict already rendered. His tone is the voice like a tank idling in a garage, heavy, mechanical, devoid of urgency. The shrapnel positioning makes intervention impossible without risking additional neurological damage. At this stage, we're looking at long-term palliative care. Comfort measures. We'll need to discuss facility placement soon. Facility placement. The words hang in the room like a guillotine blade suspended at the throat. A place where 8-year-old boys who will never speak again can be warehoused with proper insurance coding and monthly billing cycles. Natalie reads the billing codes in Marcus's chart, committing them to memory the way she used to memorize enemy positions. There's something wrong with the pattern. Too many procedures. Too many experimental treatments billed at rates that don't align with hospital standards. The numbers don't speak truth. The numbers are lying. Colonel Brennan nods slowly. His jaw tightens once. He's a man trained to accept orders, to absorb trauma, to function through dissolution. His son is becoming a ghost in front of him, and he's nodding like it's a briefing on supply chain logistics. Natalie begins checking Marcus's ventilator settings, her movements precise as surgical instruments. She adjusts the pressure support with practiced efficiency, her fingers moving to the adjustment dial without her eyes looking away from the boy's face. She's studying him. Really studying him. Most people look at Marcus and see damage. They see a prognosis. They see a closed case. She sees a child. She sees someone who survived the same blast that killed 16 other people in the convoy. She sees someone whose body is still here, even if his voice isn't. She sees potential that 10 doctors decided was worth abandoning. Her hands, scarred from Bagram, from 100 operations in field hospitals that were basically tents with fluorescent lights bolted to the top, move with the terrifying fluid precision of a predator assessing prey. Except she's not predatory. She's protective. She's measured. She's here. I'll be taking his primary nursing care, Natalie says to Dr. Whitfield, her voice soft enough to be almost deferential, the kind of voice that makes men believe they're still in charge. She's perfected this voice over 2 years. The voice of someone invisible. Someone just a nurse. I'll monitor his C-spine alignment closely and track any micro-movements in the affected region. Dr. Whitfield barely glances at her. Fine. Though I suspect you'll find his case as static as everyone else. He turns back to Colonel Brennan. I'll have my office draft the facility recommendations. We should move on this within the next 72 hours. He leaves the room, his Rolex catching light again as he exits. Natalie's jaw tightens once. Her hands remain perfectly steady. In the hallway outside Marcus's room, Dr. Whitfield laughs with 2 of the other specialists. The sound carries through the closed door, confidence wrapped in cruelty, the laughter of men who believe outcomes are predetermined. $50 says the new nurse figures out what we've all already proven, he's saying. This case is a dead end. Some kids just don't get to wake up. Natalie checks the ventilator readout again. O2 saturation 93%. Heart rate 84. Stable. Static. For now. She places her hand on Marcus's shoulder, the right side, away from the neural pathway compromise, and leaves it there for exactly 3 seconds. Long enough for pressure. Long enough for information to travel. Long enough for a child to know he's not entirely alone. Colonel Brennan watches her. His eyes are the color of a stormy Atlantic, red-rimmed, weathered from 6 months of watching his son become progressively more absent. You're new, he says quietly. It's not quite a question. Started this week, Natalie responds. Her eyes don't leave Marcus's face. I've got experience with complex spinal cases. I'll be here most nights. The doctors say it's over. The colonel's voice cracks slightly, then stabilizes. He's a man who's learned to compartmentalize devastation. They say there's nothing left to do but manage the decline. Natalie turns to look at him. For exactly 1 moment, something flickers in her expression, not sympathy, exactly. Recognition. The look of someone who has been written off before and survived anyway. The doctors say a lot of things, Colonel. Most of them are good guesses. She adjusts Marcus's pillows with movements that communicate absolute certainty. Every touch is deliberate. Every adjustment serves a purpose. Her hands know things her voice won't yet admit. Her hands know that 8-year-old children sometimes surprise people who've already decided they're finished surprising anyone. What the colonel doesn't know is that the woman standing beside his son's bed has held 78 lives together in places where the wind tastes like copper and the sky catches fire. What he doesn't know is that Natalie Hayes once saved his life in a convoy outside Bagram, 20 years ago, when she was someone else entirely. What he doesn't know is that his son is exactly why she's here. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Dr. Whitfield had no idea what he'd just challenged. The worst part was that he'd made a bet against a woman who'd never lost when the stakes actually mattered. 2 days later, Dr. Whitfield found her at the nurse's station during morning rounds. Natalie was charting on Marcus Brennan's vitals when Whitfield's shadow fell across the desk. She didn't look up. The pen moved across the page with steady, precise strokes, blood pressure, oxygen saturation, pupil response. Everything documented. Everything accurate. "Sweetheart, this handwriting is illegible." His voice carried across the station, pitched loud enough for everyone to hear. "Did they not teach penmanship in whatever community college you attended?" 4 nurses looked up. 3 residents paused mid-conversation. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as if waiting for her response. Natalie set down the pen. Her jaw clenched once, a single muscular contraction, but her hands remained perfectly steady on the desk. She didn't speak. She simply reached for the chart, uncapped her pen, and rewrote every entry in the same precise block letters. Clear. Legible. Perfect. Whitfield watched, waiting for something, a tremor, a sharp intake of breath, tears pooling. He got nothing. Her face showed nothing. When she finished, she slid the chart back across the desk without meeting his eyes. "Better," he said, his tone implying it was barely acceptable. He left the station, but she could feel his gaze lingering on her back like a physical pressure. Testing. Waiting to see if she'd crack. She didn't. The cafeteria at Cedar Creek served lunch from 11 to 1. The room was crowded that day, maintenance staff, administrative assistants, nurses between shifts, residents grabbing whatever they could between traumas. Natalie sat alone at a corner table with a sandwich, an apple, and a small cup of applesauce. Her locker contained her combat boots, a faded photograph, and exactly $43 in emergency cash. She ate the same meal most days. Dr. Whitfield came from behind without warning. His hip caught the edge of her tray with deliberate precision. The plastic plate flipped. The sandwich skidded across tile. The applesauce container hit the floor and burst, spreading in a pale, watery bloom. 20 staff members turned to look. "Oh, clumsy me," Whitfield announced to no one in particular. His voice carried the false concern of someone who had calculated every syllable. "Maybe if you weren't so distracted you'd notice people walking by. You should be more aware of your surroundings, sweetheart." The room went quiet. Not the silence of surprise, the silence of collective discomfort. Nurses exchanged glances. A maintenance worker suddenly became very focused on his coffee. Natalie knelt. She picked up each item with hands that moved like a surgeon's, economical, methodical, absolute. The sandwich. The apple. The scattered applesauce with paper towels, wiping methodically until the tile gleamed. Her face showed nothing. No anger. No humiliation. No fear. When she stood, she dumped the tray in the waste bin, walked to the cafeteria line with exact change, purchased another meal identical to the first, and sat in the same seat. Her hands remained steady as she unwrapped the new sandwich. She bit into it with the calm of someone who had already survived far worse than this. Whitfield watched from across the cafeteria. His jaw tightened. He'd expected her to leave. To hide. To call security. Something that would give him leverage, something he could weaponize in a formal complaint. Instead, she ate her lunch like he hadn't just humiliated her in front of half the hospital. The silence that lingered had teeth. That afternoon, the chart throwing came. Natalie was standing at the nurse's station updating orders when Whitfield approached with a patient's file in his right hand. He didn't speak. He simply threw it. The folder opened mid-air, and papers scattered like confetti across the floor, lab results, imaging reports, nursing notes dispersing in all directions. 6 nursing staff watched. 3 residents froze. The smell of antiseptic mixed with the papery scent of scattered medical records. "Pick that up, sweetheart," Whitfield said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Since you're so good at being on your knees." The implication hung in the air like something toxic. Natalie's hands did not shake as she knelt. She gathered each page, methodical, precise, straightening them one by one, checking that no vital information had been damaged. Her face remained blank. A mask so complete that it looked like serenity, though the residents watching didn't understand what they were actually witnessing. They weren't seeing composure. They were seeing the discipline of someone whose hands had held bleeding soldiers on foreign soil, whose eyes had seen the worst humanity could offer, and who would not give this man, this small, petty man, the satisfaction of breaking her. She clipped each page back into the folder. She stood. She walked to the supply closet without a word, locked the door behind her, and for exactly 30 seconds her fingers gripped the edge of the metal shelf with enough force to make her knuckles white. She breathed through her nose. Slow. Controlled. In for 4. Hold for 4. Out for 4. The trembling in her hands was not fear. It was the precise opposite of fear. It was restraint. It was the effort of holding back something lethal. When the 30 seconds ended, she released the shelf. She looked at her hands in the semi-darkness. Steady again. The trembling ceased. She emerged from the closet and returned to her station. Whitfield was waiting, arms crossed, watching for any crack in her facade. He found none. Evening brought the morning rounds review, the daily assessment of patient outcomes and clinical decisions. Whitfield had scheduled it for 6 p.m., after the day shift had begun winding down but while enough staff remained to witness whatever he was planning. Natalie sat at the far end of the table, her eyes on Marcus Brennan's file, reading his latest vitals. Whitfield opened his leather portfolio. Inside were papers, billing codes, procedure notes. He placed them on the table with ceremonial precision. "Let's discuss clinical competence," he began, his eyes fixed on her. "Some of our staff seem to think they understand complex pediatric neurology. They don't. This patient," he gestured toward Marcus's file, "requires a specialist's touch. Not a nurse's guess." The room shifted. 3 residents looked uncomfortable. 2 nurses stared at their own files. "The imaging supports continued conservative management," Natalie said quietly. Her voice was level. Measured. Not deferential, just factual. "Current vitals are stable." "Your opinion is noted," Whitfield cut her off. "And unwanted. Effective immediately, this patient's assessments will be conducted by myself only. You'll continue with standard nursing care, vital signs, basic hygiene, but no clinical assessments. No interpretations. No involvement in treatment decisions. You're beyond your pay grade." He was smart about it. He didn't order her to stay away. He simply stripped away her access, her authority, her ability to help. Strategic. Competent. The kind of move that would hold up in a peer review. Natalie felt something shift inside her chest, not panic, but clarity. Marcus's file sat on the table before her. His imaging from 6 weeks ago. His current neurological status. And somewhere between the two, a pattern that only she had noticed. A fragment of shrapnel moving millimeter by millimeter. A position that could be corrected. A life that could be saved. But only if she had access. Only if Whitfield let her near him. She closed the file. She looked at Whitfield across the table and did not blink. "Understood, doctor." The words were simple. Compliant. But something in the way she said them made the room's temperature drop by several degrees. The residents exchanged glances. One of them, a young surgeon named Chen, felt her pulse rate spike without understanding why. Whitfield smiled. He'd won the round. What he didn't know was that he'd just activated a response protocol that existed in Natalie's muscle memory like a dormant weapon. The kind of protocol that had been trained into her across 3 deployments. The kind that didn't respond to hierarchy or policy or hospital procedure. The kind that responded only to the clock ticking toward a child's last chance. The records room was on the basement level of Cedar Creek Medical, 3 floors below the pediatric ward where Marcus Brennan lay in his mechanical silence. Natalie had started coming here at 11 p.m., after her shift ended, after the hallways emptied, after the only sound was the low industrial hum of the fax system pushing recycled air through the building's arteries. She'd spend 2, sometimes 3 hours in that fluorescent-lit tomb, pulling patient charts from the file system, cross-referencing billing codes against actual documented procedures, her scarred fingers moving through the paper trail like a detective following blood spatter. Night 4, she found it. Marcus Brennan's chart showed a surgical procedure logged as experimental neural repositioning protocol on March 12. The code billed to the Colonel's military insurance was Captain 64999, a modifier code for unlisted nerve procedures. The bill amount was $47,000. Natalie pulled the operative notes. There were none. No surgeon listed. No anesthesia record. No post-op complications documented. Just the billing code and the amount, sitting in the file like a confession waiting to be read. She photographed it with her personal phone, the camera flash briefly illuminating her face like a strobe, then moved on to the next file. March 18, another entry. Experimental spinal stabilization therapy. Captain 63685, modified. $51,300 billed. Again, no operative notes. No procedure documentation. Just the code and the theft, spelled out in medical billing language that most people would never think to question. Most people didn't spend 18 years learning how to read what wasn't written. Natalie's hands moved methodically through the stack. She wasn't shaking. She wasn't angry. Anger was a luxury. Anger was the luxury of people who didn't have a mission. She documented everything in a small leather notebook she kept in her uniform pocket: dates, billing codes, amounts, the stark absence of medical justification. The pattern was unmistakable. Dr. Whitfield had submitted 42 billing entries over 8 months. The documented procedures in Marcus's medical chart bore no relation to the billed procedures. The fraud was comprehensive, calculated, institutional. And Dr. Whitfield had positioned himself as untouchable. She'd watched him move through Cedar Creek Medical like a man who understood exactly where the power lived. The hospital board chair, Dr. Patricia Chen's protégé. 3 sitting senators on his fundraising board. A medical school named after his family at UCSD. The kind of institutional weight that didn't bend. The kind that broke things that tried to move it. Natalie photographed 17 more entries. Her phone storage filled with images of billing codes that didn't match procedures that didn't exist. The Colonel's military insurance was being systematically drained for treatments that should have been filed as no procedure performed or observation only. At this billing rate, Dr. Whitfield had extracted approximately $2.1 million from the military health system in 8 months. The fraud would have continued indefinitely if anyone competent ever looked at the file, cross-checked the codes, and asked the simple question, where is the documentation? She closed the file carefully. Replaced it in its slot. The records room was silent except for the HVAC's low industrial breathing, the sound of a building maintaining its own life while smaller lives hung in the balance. Natalie sat down on the cold linoleum floor with her back against the file cabinet and opened her notebook, reviewing each entry by the flat glow of the emergency exit sign. The evidence was mathematical. Irrefutable. Cold. But evidence alone wouldn't move Colonel Brennan to action. Military men needed chain of command. They needed authorization. They needed the kind of proof that came with institutional backing, the kind that moved through official channels and created paperwork trails that nobody could deny. Natalie couldn't just walk into the Colonel's office with billing fraud accusations. She wasn't anyone. She was just the new nurse who'd arrived 6 weeks ago, whose access was being systematically restricted, who'd been publicly humiliated in the cafeteria and the halls. Anything she said would sound like retaliation. She needed the fraud to be discovered through official channels. She needed someone with authority to find what she'd found and act on it independent of her involvement. She needed distance between the discovery and her name. The mission had taught her patience. The mission had taught her that the fastest route wasn't always the one that worked. Natalie photographed the notebook pages with methodical precision, each entry clear, each date legible, each billing code visible. She uploaded the images to an encrypted cloud drive she'd created under a false identity years ago, the kind of digital footprint that didn't exist in any official system. Then she deleted the phone's photos. No trail. No evidence that she'd been the one who compiled the documentation. Just the images, waiting in the cloud, ready to be anonymously forwarded to the office of the Inspector General whenever the moment was right. She climbed the basement stairs at 2:41 a.m., moving through the sleeping hospital like she belonged there, which she did. Cedar Creek Medical at night was a different building. The day shift's urgency was gone. The hierarchy was flatter. The night nurses ran on coffee and instinct, checking monitors, adjusting medications, moving patients through their small rotations of care. Nobody paid attention to the new nurse ascending from the records room. Nobody questioned her presence. She was just another person keeping the machine alive while the city slept outside. The pediatric floor was quiet when she reached it. She passed Marcus's room, door closed, hallway monitor showing steady vitals, the mechanical rhythm of the ventilator visible through the small window as a gentle expansion and contraction of the boy's chest. He was in there. 8 years old. Quadriplegic. Nonverbal. His mind intact but locked behind a wall of nerve damage and shrapnel and medical neglect. Waiting for someone to prove the 10 specialists wrong. Natalie kept walking. Her limp was more pronounced in the empty hallway, her left leg dragging slightly, a permanent reminder of Kandahar. Most people didn't notice it. Most people didn't look closely enough at the people who served them. Dr. Whitfield wouldn't have noticed either. He wouldn't have seen the way her hands moved with surgical precision in the records room, or understood what hands like that were capable of, or recognized the particular quality of stillness that came from having made peace with violence. She made it to the break room and sat alone with black coffee, watching the darkness outside the window. The city lights of San Diego stretched toward the horizon, sodium vapor and neon bleeding into the pre-dawn black. Her phone buzzed. A message from a blocked number, status update required. How is the asset? The asset. Marcus. The language was deliberate and clinical, the way operational commands were supposed to be. Natalie typed back 3 words, asset stable. Investigating complications. It was the truth, technically. Complicated was one word for what Marcus Brennan was becoming, the center of a fraud scheme that stretched from Dr. Whitfield's office to military insurance claims in Arlington, from Cedar Creek Medical's billing department to the colonel's career, possibly to his standing with the Pentagon if this went public the wrong way. She finished her coffee. Moved to the geriatric floor where she was officially assigned, where the patients were stable and the work was rote and nobody cared that she was present or absent. She changed her shoes. Her combat boots stayed in her locker, the leather scuffed and salt-stained from Bagram 20 years ago, from the day Colonel Brennan's leg was shredded by shrapnel that should have killed him but didn't because Natalie had been there with a field tourniquet and the kind of composure that came from having already watched 3 men die that morning. The boots were the MacGuffin nobody understood. The artifact that meant everything. The reason she'd let Dr. Whitfield humiliate her without flinching, why she'd accepted the restricted access, why she could absorb insult after insult with the particular stillness of a person who'd sacrificed far worse. The fraud was just noise. The real problem was the clock. Marcus's neurological status was declining. She'd seen it in his latest imaging, the inflammation around the shrapnel fragment was increasing, the pressure on the nerve cluster growing tighter, his brain's ability to adapt to the damage shrinking with each passing week. The 10 specialists had given him 6 months before the deterioration became irreversible. That timeline was now at 5 weeks remaining. Dr. Whitfield had set up the perfect cover for the fraud. Marcus's condition would deteriorate regardless of the experimental procedures. Whether the treatments were legitimate or fabricated, the boy would fail to recover, and the failure would be medically inevitable, neurologically sound, completely defensible in any liability hearing. The fraud would be forgotten in the tragedy. The colonel's grief would overshadow any questions about the billing. The military insurance would have paid out millions for procedures that never happened, and by the time anyone audited the file, Marcus Brennan would be dead or permanently locked in, and Dr. Whitfield would be on his 5th hospital position, his reputation built on the foundation of other people's desperation. Natalie knew how to stop it. She knew exactly what she needed to do. She just needed to wait for the moment when stopping it required breaking every rule. That moment was coming. The clock was running. And when it arrived, she would be ready, her hand steady, her mind clear, the particular violence of a trained operator locked behind the mask of a nurse who'd learned to absorb humiliation the way other people absorbed water, completely, without resistance, without breaking the surface tension. She checked the 4 line on room for 12. An 87-year-old woman with COPD, stable, sleeping. Moved to room for 15. A 92-year-old man post-stroke, left side paralyzed, eyes tracking her as she adjusted his medication pump. She touched his shoulder once, brief and professional. "You're going to be okay," she said, and meant it, because everyone on this floor would be okay. They had time. They had family. They had lives already lived. Marcus didn't have any of those things yet. Marcus had nothing but a clock ticking backward and a mother who'd probably forgotten how to pray and a father who was 3 hours away at Edwards Air Force Base, building weapon systems, trusting that the hospital would keep his son alive. The sun rose at 6:44 a.m. over San Diego, painting the sky in shades of copper and rose, and Natalie Hayes stood at the geriatric station, charting vitals, her hands moving through routine with the efficiency of someone who'd been trained to do 3 jobs simultaneously while under fire. Nobody could see the evidence she'd compiled. Nobody could see the encrypted cloud files or the photograph of Dr. Whitfield's billing fraud stacked like cards waiting to collapse. Nobody could see the particular darkness of her focus, the way her mind was already mapping the hours until the moment when the hospital's protocols would become obstacles instead of guidelines, when every rule would need to break simultaneously, when being a Master Chief Petty Officer would matter infinitely more than being a nurse. The fraud was documented. The conspiracy was mapped. The timeline was clear. All she needed now was the trigger. All she needed was for Marcus Brennan to reach the point where the only option left was to choose between protocol and survival, between following the 10 specialists' conclusion that he was permanently broken and acting on the intelligence her hands understood at a level that 10 years of medical school could never reach, the intelligence of someone who'd learned to read what the body was trying to say beneath the silence. She checked her watch. 6:52 a.m. She had 38 minutes before the day shift arrived and the hospital returned to its normal hierarchy of power and protocol and Dr. Whitfield's unchallenged institutional wait. 38 minutes to drink another coffee and wait for the next shift change. 38 minutes before the building filled with doctors and administrators and all the small tyrannies that kept the machine running. Marcus had 5 weeks. Natalie had a notebook full of evidence and a pair of combat boots in her locker and the particular calm that came from knowing exactly what she was willing to sacrifice. The fraud would be exposed. The boy would be saved. Dr. Whitfield would fall. It was all just a matter of timing and patience, and understanding that the quietest wars were fought with documentation instead of weapons, with evidence instead of violence, with the kind of evidence that couldn't be argued with or dismissed or buried by institutional power. She finished her second coffee and waited for the day to begin. The code blue alarm screamed from the 3rd floor at 7:41 a.m. Not a drill. Not a practice. The kind of sound that makes every nurse in a hospital move at the same speed, toward it, into it, without hesitation. Natalie was on the 5th floor, charting vitals in the pediatric wing, her hand steady on the keyboard when she heard it. 3 floors down. Not her patient. Not her assignment. She kept typing. But her body recognized the pattern before her mind did. The alarm's rhythm. The overhead page that followed, code blue, room 307. Cardiac arrest. Room 307 was Marcus Brennan's room. Natalie moved. No decision was made. Her legs carried her through the door, down the corridor, toward the stairwell. Elevator was too slow. Stairs. For steps at a time, her combat boots hitting the tile with a rhythm like artillery. 1, 2, 3, 4, her lungs steady, her heart rate exactly where it needed to be. 20 years. 20 years since she'd run toward a patient in full cardiac arrest instead of away from the paperwork and policy that now governed civilian medicine. 20 years since her hands had done this kind of work. The third-floor hallway erupted into controlled chaos. Nurses pushing the crash cart, residents jogging with that strange urgency that meant no one actually knew what they were doing. She could see it from 30 feet away, the kind of frozen panic that sets in when the patient is a child and the prognosis was already written. Natalie pushed through the door to room 307. The monitor showed what she already knew, flat line. Marcus's small chest rose and fell with the rhythm of the ambu bag, squeeze, release, but his heart wasn't beating. His face was the color of wet concrete. The attending physician, Dr. Morrison, stood with his hands at his sides, not moving, not speaking. 3 residents circled the bed like they were waiting for instructions from a god who'd stopped answering prayers. Epinephrine, Natalie said. Her voice came from somewhere deeper than her throat, from somewhere that had learned to command in the sound of incoming fire. 1 milligram for now. A resident moved. Dr. Morrison didn't. Someone bag him, Natalie continued, stepping forward. I need a surgical tray. Size for .0 endotracheal tube. Now. What she needed was access. What she needed was a chest she could crack open. What she needed was to do the thing that no civilian doctor in this hospital would think to do, because civilian doctors followed the ACLS protocol, chest compressions on the sternum, CPR from the outside, hoping the heart would restart on its own. But Marcus's heart had stopped once before. His parasympathetic nervous system was already failing. External compression wouldn't work. It never had. She needed to go in. A nurse appeared with a tray. Surgical instruments glinted under the fluorescent lights. Natalie's hands moved with mechanical precision, scalpel in her right hand, her left palm flat against Marcus's small ribs. 3 movements. 1 incision across the left anterior thorax, for inches long, through skin that had been whole just seconds before. 2. Spreading the ribs with her gloved fingers, feeling them give way like branches, the leverage exquisite and exact. 3. Opening the pericardium, the membrane around the heart, until she could see it. Grey and still. The room had gone quiet. Even the monitors seemed to pause. Dr. Morrison stood frozen, his face the color of the walls. A resident whispered something. Natalie didn't hear it. She heard only the sound of her own breathing, the sound of air moving through her nose, the same rhythm she'd learned in a tent hospital in Bagram when the electricity had failed and the surgical lights ran on a generator that might die at any second. Her fingers found the boy's heart. It fit in her palm. She began to compress it, not roughly, but with the kind of precision that comes from knowing that force and gentleness are different things when you're holding a life in your hand. For minutes. The clock in her head started ticking. For minutes until the brain damage became irreversible. For minutes until this child was gone. Compress. Release. Compress. Release. Blood moved through the ventricles, she could feel it, pushed by her hand instead of the electricity that should have been his own heart's job. O2 saturation from the bagging, 78. 82, 87. The line on the monitor still flat. Still dead. 30 seconds of manual compression. Her fingers moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who had done this in worse conditions, in the dark, in the rain, in the mud of Bagram, with instruments made from what she could find. Marcus's heart was no different than any other heart. Anatomy was truth. Mechanics were absolute. Then her fingers found what she was looking for. The shrapnel fragment. She could feel it under her fingertips, a small hard thing pressing against the nerve cluster that Dr. Whitfield had documented in his case files but never actually attempted to address. It was there, right where the imaging suggested, a piece of metal the size of a small grain of rice, lodged against the autonomic nerve bundle that controlled his cardiac rhythm. No civilian trauma surgeon would have attempted this. They would have followed protocol. They would have kept compressing, kept hoping. They would have let the boy die rather than move a piece of shrapnel that millimeters might shift the difference between life and death. Natalie's fingers repositioned. Her other hand continued the compression. She moved the fragment, carefully, deliberately, 2 millimeters to the left, away from the nerve cluster. The motion took less than a second. And then Marcus's heart beat. Not a flutter. Not a weak pulse trying to restart. A strong, deliberate thump under her palm. Then another. Then the monitor came alive with a rhythm, sinus rhythm, perfect and clean, the electrical signal of a heart that had remembered how to beat on its own. The room erupted. "We've got a pulse," someone shouted. "We've got sinus rhythm." The residents scrambled toward the bed, pushing her aside gently, their faces transformed from frozen panic into something that looked like hope. A nurse squeezed Marcus's shoulder. Dr. Morrison opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again. But Natalie saw what the others hadn't yet. Marcus's fingers. His right hand. The fingers that had been still for 6 months, completely, entirely paralyzed, twitched. Not a reflex. Not a ghost signal. A deliberate, conscious movement of muscles that should have been dead. She stepped back. Her hands dropped to her sides. Blood still clung to her gloves in patterns that looked like maps of places she wasn't supposed to remember. A young resident was bagging Marcus, now with an open chest and a beating heart underneath. Someone was on the phone with the OR. Someone else was running an EKG. Natalie turned and walked out of the room. The door closed behind her with a soft click. She made it to the break room. She didn't sit. She stood at the window, looking out at San Diego's morning light spreading across the parking lot like an accusation. Her hands were shaking. Not from fear. Not from uncertainty. Her hands were shaking with the kind of tremor that comes from muscles remembering work they'd been trained to do but had promised never to do again. 20 years. That's how long she'd told herself she was done with combat medicine, done with the kind of decisions that separated the quick from the dead. 20 years of being just a nurse, just a hospital employee, just someone who followed protocol and documented vitals and never, ever cracked open a child's chest with surgical precision under fluorescent lights. 20 years was apparently not long enough. She was still standing there when her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number, HR 1 p.m. Bring all personal items. One hand flat on the window. The glass was cold. Outside, she could see birds moving in the palms trees, ordinary birds, on an ordinary morning, in a city that didn't know that a child who should have been dead was now breathing, now awake, now reaching for his father with fingers that had no right to move. She checked her watch. 8:14 a.m. For hours and 46 minutes until they fired her. She allowed herself exactly 30 seconds of stillness. Then she went back to work. The morning held its breath. By 10 a.m., the OR had stabilized Marcus, vital steady, cognitive response positive, neurological exams showing what the doctors kept calling unprecedented recovery. By noon, Marcus was being moved to the ICU with a private guard, his father already flying in from Colorado Springs, his case becoming the kind of medical anomaly that would require explanations that no one in Cedar Creek Medical could actually provide. Natalie spent those hours in the pediatric ward, charting vitals on other patients, dispensing medications, moving through her shift with the kind of careful invisibility that comes from knowing the end was coming. She could see Dr. Whitfield on the 4th floor, pacing, on his phone, his face transforming through colors she'd never seen on a human being. Red. Purple. A kind of mottled white that looked like fury and fear having a conversation under his skin. At 1 p.m. exactly, the HR director was waiting in a small room on the 6th floor. Her name was Susan. She had kind eyes and a prepared statement written on hospital letterhead. Unauthorized medical procedure. Violation of nursing protocol. Patient endangerment. Suspension of privileges pending investigation. Natalie's security badge was deactivated at 1:13 p.m. The director was apologetic. The director was also final. By 7 p.m., Natalie was alone in the hospital's basement laundry room, folding her scrubs. The fabric smelled of antiseptic and Marcus's blood, washed but not yet erased, the scent of something that had been broken and then briefly held together with human hands. She folded each piece carefully, sleeves in, shoulders aligned, the fabric forming rectangles of blue cotton that meant nothing now and had meant everything 6 hours ago. She placed the folded scrubs on the counter. Next to them, she set her combat boots from Bagram. 20 years old. Scuffed beyond repair. The leather creased in places where her feet had moved through fire and dust and the kind of decisions that don't get made in hospitals. 2 years of cover work. 2 years of being invisible. 2 years of watching a child lie paralyzed while 10 specialists said there was nothing to be done, while a doctor billed military insurance for procedures that meant nothing, while she documented fraud and waited for the moment when waiting would no longer be enough. The moment had come and gone in 4 minutes. Outside the laundry room, the hospital moved forward into evening. Machines beeped. Patients slept. Doctors moved between rooms, making notes on charts, checking vitals, following the protocols that kept the machinery running. Somewhere on the 3rd floor, Marcus Brennan was squeezing his father's hand with fingers that had no business moving. And somewhere in a small room on the 6th floor, Dr. Whitfield was discovering that the woman he'd called sweetheart, the woman he'd thrown trays at, the woman whose incompetence he'd documented and celebrated and prepared to destroy, had just saved his career's biggest liability. He would spend the next 20 hours trying to fix it. Making phone calls. Activating his network. Calling the hospital board chair. Calling the chief of staff. Calling the medical investigator he'd helped get licensed 15 years ago and never expected to use. By morning, Natalie's firing would be official. By noon, her name would be removed from the hospital roster. By evening, she would be something no one had expected her to be. The question was whether anyone would ever know who she actually was before the Pentagon did. Dr. Whitfield's hands moved with the precision of a surgeon who'd just watched his career detonate. The phone came up to his ear before Marcus's heart had stabilized, before the monitors had even settled into a steady rhythm. His fingers trembled, not from the adrenaline of the save, but from the cold certainty that everything he'd built was collapsing in real time. He stepped into the hallway, his white coat still damp with saline solution, and made 3 calls in rapid succession. The hospital board chair answered on the 2nd ring. The chief of staff was in a meeting but took the call anyway. The medical investigator, a man Whitfield had personally helped get licensed 8 years ago, a debt that was about to be called in, picked up before the 1st ring finished. "We have a problem," Whitfield said, his voice carrying the weight of institutional authority. "An unauthorized procedure. Open chest cardiac massage on a pediatric patient. Protocol violation. Possible criminal negligence." Each word landed like a hammer blow, designed to move fast, to lodge itself in the right minds before anyone could ask questions. He didn't mention that the procedure had worked. He didn't mention that Marcus's fingers had moved for the first time in 6 months. He mentioned only the violation, the protocol breach, the danger to the hospital's accreditation. By the time he hung up the phone, the machinery was already in motion. 18 hours. That's all the time institutional power needed to move. Natalie received the termination notice at 6:27 a.m., printed on hospital letterhead and delivered by HR, who wouldn't make eye contact. Cause: unauthorized medical intervention outside scope of nursing practice. Violation of hospital protocol. Patient safety concern. The language was careful. It didn't accuse. It simply removed. Her security badge was deactivated before she could walk to her locker. She was escorted by a security guard, the same one who'd nodded at her in the break room every morning for 16 months, who now stared straight ahead and said nothing. His jaw was clenched so hard she could see the muscle working beneath his skin. The laundry room at midnight smelled like industrial bleach and the ghost of 1,000 shifts. Natalie folded her scrubs with the same precision she'd used to pack her duffel bag 16 months ago when she arrived. The fabric still held the smell of antiseptic and something else, the sharp copper undertone of blood, barely perceptible unless you knew what you were looking for. She'd learned to read blood in a trauma bay in Kandahar, where the smell meant you had minutes, sometimes seconds, before a decision became irreversible. She folded the scrub top into thirds, then into sixths, creating perfect geometric lines. The scrub pants followed. Her undershirt. Her compression socks. Each item went into a stack that grew smaller and more precise as her hands moved through the motions of her other life, the one where she was supposed to be invisible. On the metal counter beside the folded scrub sat a pair of combat boots. Battered. Scarred. The leather was cracked from 2 decades of desert sun and mountain rain. The laces had been replaced 3 times. The soles had walked through Kandahar and Helmand and Paktia province. The right boot still had a dark stain on the heel, not blood, but rust from shrapnel that had lodged there in 2004 when the IED detonated 8 meters from her position. She'd removed the shrapnel herself with a trauma shear and kept the boot anyway. Some people carry photographs. Some carry dog tags. Natalie carried boots that proved she'd survived things that were supposed to kill her. She sat on the edge of the laundry counter and stared at the boots for 3 minutes without moving. Around her, the industrial dryers hummed their mindless rhythm. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in plastic. Outside, San Diego's rain hammered against the high window, the kind of rain that only comes in winter and sounds like applause from an angry audience. The mission was over. Failed. Marcus would recover, yes, the procedure had worked, the shrapnel had shifted, the nerve cluster had been decompressed. But Whitfield would file a complaint through channels she didn't have access to anymore. The evidence she'd gathered, the encrypted photos of the billing fraud, the documented procedures that never happened, was gone. She'd left it all on a secure server that was useless if she couldn't access it from inside the hospital. She believed she had time. She believed the military would extract her properly. She believed that evidence and protocol and the truth would matter. She'd been wrong before. She could be wrong again. At 6:23 a.m. the next morning, the sound came first. Not sirens. Not alarms. The sound of helicopter rotors cutting the air like something ancient and mechanical learning to breathe. 3 UH-60M Blackhawks descended through the San Diego cloud cover in formation that was too tight, too aggressive, too military to be anything other than what it was, a show of force. They landed on Cedar Creek Medical's rooftop helipad in sequence, the blades still turning, the rotor wash sending a gust of wind down through the stairwell that rattled every door in the hospital. On the street below, a military convoy materialized as if it had always been there. 6 vehicles. Hummers with markings that didn't belong to any branch that admitted to existing. Men in dress uniforms climbing out with the synchronized precision of people who'd practiced moving together until movement became language. The hospital board chair was in the second-floor boardroom reviewing Dr. Whitfield's presentation, his charts, his graphs, his meticulous documentation of advanced treatment protocols that had somehow resulted in a child's recovery that defied medical explanation. Whitfield was explaining away the open-chest procedure as an emergency response, unfortunate but justified, requiring investigation but not necessarily termination. The board members were nodding. His network was holding. His influence was working. His phone was ringing. Then the elevator doors opened and a Marine colonel stepped out, his uniform carrying the weight of authority that didn't require explanation. Behind him came 2 MPs with faces carved from stone. Behind them came a 2-star general who'd flown in from the Pentagon. The Marine colonel entered the boardroom without knocking. Every head turned. Every voice stopped. He spoke one word, Reaper. The Navy veteran who worked security, a man who'd served 8 years on a destroyer, who'd seen the Persian Gulf and lived to tell about it, went white. His hand moved to his chest in a salute that was automatic, involuntary, a response to hierarchy that went deeper than conscious thought. "Master Chief Petty Officer," he said quietly. 3 Purple Hearts. Silver Star. 78 combat saves including a field amputation that saved a colonel's life in Bagram. The 2-star general opened a classified file that had been sealed until 90 seconds ago. She read details from Natalie's service record that made the board chair's hand shake. 23 years of active duty. For combat tours. Citations that required a security clearance to access. Operations in places that didn't officially exist. An assignment to Cedar Creek Medical on direct orders from Naval Special Warfare Command. Then Colonel James Brennan stood up. His uniform bore the insignia of the United States Air Force. His spine was straight despite the pain that still lived in his shoulder where shrapnel had lodged in 2004. He spoke slowly, each word chosen with the precision of military communication. "This woman," he said, gesturing to where Natalie now stood in the doorway in dress white uniform, "saved my life 20 years ago in Bagram. I requested her placement here to protect my son when the medical bills stopped making sense. To protect him from a doctor who was billing us $3 million for procedures that don't exist." Marcus Brennan stood next to his father. The boy's hand moved up, slowly, deliberately, and squeezed his father's hand. Not a reflexive grip. Not the involuntary spasm of muscles relearning their purpose. A conscious choice. A deliberate action. The same hand that had been paralyzed 6 months ago, before a nurse with combat boots and a classified clearance had cracked open his chest and manually compressed his heart while shifting the shrapnel away from his brainstem. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Dr. Whitfield opened his mouth to speak. But he was looking at Natalie now, at the insignia on her uniform, at the ribbons that told a story he'd never bothered to ask about. Her gaze passed over him like a weapon that had already fired. She was watching Marcus count the deliberate flexes of his fingers, watching the 10 specialists who'd written him off try to reconcile a recovery they'd declared medically impossible. She didn't acknowledge Whitfield. She didn't need to. The institutional machinery was already moving in a direction his calls and his network could never stop. 40 minutes later, Dr. Patricia Chen's email arrived in the board chair's inbox, CC'd to the California Medical Board, the hospital's accreditation authority, and the San Diego Tribune. 5 sentences. That was all it took. "I am publicly disowning Dr. Robert Whitfield and demanding a full board review of his conduct and clinical practices. The behavior shown in this video is antithetical to every principle I attempted to teach him. I regret my letter of recommendation that placed him at your institution." The video had already gone viral, a nurse's cell phone recording of a chart being thrown at a woman's feet in front of a dozen witnesses. 4 million views in 18 hours. The comment section was a river of rage from people who'd somehow recognized injustice even without context. Federal investigators presented evidence, $2.3 million in fraudulent billing across 18 months, experimental procedures that were actually standard treatments billed at triple rate, imaging studies filed in duplicate and triplicate, kickback arrangements with a medical supply company that had been operating for 9 years. His medical license was suspended pending investigation. His hospital privileges were terminated effective immediately. Security escort to his office. Personal items in a box. The hallway where he'd thrown a chart at a woman who'd turned out to be a Navy legend, and now he couldn't even make himself visible to her anymore. 6 months passed like a door closing. The board hearing. The divorce filing. The malpractice suits from 14 former patients whose procedures had been unnecessary, whose insurance had been defrauded, whose trust had been sold for profit. Job applications across 3 states, all rejected. Professional references from colleagues who'd suddenly decided they couldn't comment. Then a gymnasium in San Diego, where a man in a community college polo shirt taught chest compressions to 20 students earning minimum wage and living in a studio apartment in El Cajon, while at the Pentagon, a woman in dress white stood in a ceremony room with flags from all service branches, and a boy who'd been given up on walked beside her with a cane, his gait slow but deliberate, his hand moving with conscious purpose. Natalie's worn combat boots from Bagram were displayed in a shadow box on Colonel Brennan's office wall at Edwards Air Force Base, under a plaque that read, "Master Chief Natalie Hayes, Reaper, saved my life 2004, saved my son 2024. True heroism is what you do when the world stops watching. If you've made it this far, you've seen what happens when institutional corruption meets someone willing to pay the cost of exposure. Subscribe for more stories of hidden strength. Comment below, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value? Like and share if you believe the quietest person in the room might just be holding it all together.